So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this launch event for the campaign against climate change, euphemistically called Pamphlet, which is actually an excellent book, which is available online and to order. So obviously we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So we've got some guest speakers this evening. Our host speaker, of course, is Steve. Steve will be speaking about the actual pamphlet shortly. Then I'd like to introduce Suzanne Jeffrey, who's the chair of the campaign against climate change and NEU rep. We'd also like to welcome Ellen Rowbottom from Leeds TUC and a Unite community member, and Tahir Latif, who's the PCS executive member and chair of PCS Aviation Group. So forgive me for having to read all that, but that was quite a lot to remember. So the plan is we're just going to go through briefly and talk about some of the highlights within the leaflet. So I'm going to share that on the screen shortly. But once Steve's taken us through that, then we are going to invite the speakers one at a time to come on and speak about the content and the campaign behind it. And then we'll open it up to questions and comments after that. So this is the campaign leaflet, which is being launched. I haven't read it all because it is quite a long booklet, but there's a lot of very valuable information and some really great ideas and arguments to be made from those who probably don't really want to listen. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Steve.
Right. Well, I mean, the speakers know he'll probably speak much more authority than I can. I mean, I think what is important about this pamphlet, it's not just a question about climate jobs, though obviously that's what it's about, but it's also really a program about how we move to a carbon-free society, really, and it's something that is actually a positive one. What we do have is a lot of the right wing, some of the hard right Tories are pushing the idea that really transition is a terrible thing. The poor are going to get hit, and it's all these awful middle class people just banging on about it, and you don't want to know anything. You don't want it to happen. You don't really want any kind of transition, which of course is absolutely wrong, and they know it, I think. So there are lots of, it covers a wide range of things. There's an introduction about what we need to do, talking about obviously moving to renewables. Then of course, particularly warm homes, buildings. Then we're talking about, you can read the contents. It goes a long way, and it's totally packed with really useful information that has been backed up by proper research.
And what I'd like to do now is to invite the speakers up one at a time. And our opening speaker this evening is Suzanne Jeffrey, who I noticed was also the editor of the booklet, so will be no doubt an authority. Suzanne.
Thanks, Ivan. An authority, most definitely. That is exactly what I am. Thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction. And thanks most definitely for the invitation to speak at the launch that you're having locally. We really appreciate the work that you put into it, and hopefully we can give you some ideas about what we've included in the pamphlet. And you're absolutely right, Ivor. We must stop calling it a pamphlet, because it isn't a pamphlet. It is a booklet, 96 pages long, I believe. But we had every intention of producing a booklet. But once the work had begun, actually it was kind of nigh on impossible to cover what needs to be covered in what you would actually call a pamphlet. My name is Suzanne, and I've edited the pamphlet, and Ellen is a lead author of 2 of the chapters. on energy and buildings, and Tahir is also a lead author of 2 of the chapters on transport and industry. So they'll flesh out a little bit more in terms of the chapters that they have contributed, that they've led and they contributed to. So for myself, I just want to say that the following things. The work began in an attempt to update our 1 Million Climate Jobs booklet, which was last updated and printed in 2014. There was a need to update that. Not that many of the key arguments didn't still stand, they did. But clearly there were a number of developments, both in terms of technology, but also the urgency of the climate crisis. The reality, the lived reality that many of us, experience, some of us much more acutely, in some parts of the world more acutely, the lived reality of a climate crisis, and the more and more urgent reports coming from the scientists about the limited amount of time that we really have, this decade really, to make some serious attempt to reduce emissions in order to stay below that 1.5 degree warming, and beyond that, it's a climate which we wouldn't recognise. It clearly is a death sentence for millions of people, and really sort of all kinds of feedback mechanisms kicking into play, which we don't know what the consequences are. So you have that urgency. I think you have a changed climate movement. I mean, we saw it on the streets around COP26, a movement in which young people took the lead and really, sort of impressed upon us the need for action and the urgency of that action. And many trade unions and trade unionists have increasingly and rightly so engaged with the issue. So the need to update the report, the urgency of the climate crisis, and a vibrant climate movement into which trade unions are at different levels and in different degrees, understanding that it is a trade union issue and that trade unions need to be at the forefront of it. One more issue, I think, and I've kind of referenced it, as the climate crisis has become more mainstream, if you sort of understand that meaning of it, politicians that previously really were climate deniers and dismissed it, our own prime minister being one of them, suddenly Damascus conversions and recognizing the urgency of the climate crisis. But as that happens, then the solutions that are presented really need to be interrogated. Are the solutions to the climate crisis that are being presented by certain groups in society, certain sections of society, are they really going to tackle the climate crisis? Are they going to transition the society in the ways that we need to? Do they tackle the other elements of crises that dominate our society, the levels of inequality, the redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich, the health crises that we've experienced? Do they begin to tackle those, or is it simply ways of maintaining a sort of status quo whilst greenwashing or playing lip service to the fact that we have an urgent climate crisis and fundamentally not a great deal changes, and indeed even fossil fuel use and production just it kind of tinkered with, but not fundamentally challenged, and certainly not keeping the fossil fuels in the ground. So all that's the rationale of it. So therefore, what are the key themes of the report? One, if we are to tackle the climate crisis, then actually many more jobs could be created than simply 1 million climate jobs. Tackling the climate crisis is not simply about a kind of narrow focus on a small part of the economy, on the energy and on the energy system, for example. In the trade union movement, we do talk about just transition, and we are absolutely right to talk about just transition. We are absolutely right to demand that people who work in high carbon industries are provided with equal employment in terms of skills, trade union organisation, pay. We're right to talk about just transition. But I think that we need to understand the transition that we need to tackle the climate crisis much, much more broadly. It is not simply about transitioning certain groups of workers from high carbon into low carbon industries. It's about a full transformation of our economy, of our society. And only by doing that, really, do we start to talk about tackling the climate crisis. So the booklet doesn't simply talk about energy, although that's absolutely crucial and absolutely key. It also talks about how do we transition across the whole of the economy? How do we transition so that our buildings are warm and insulated and safe? And we tackle fuel poverty. How do we transition our transport sector, the full transport sector, the full range of transport, so that it is genuinely low carbon, and it also allows people across all social, economic, and different groups to access a free or affordable public transport system. How do we restore our nature? We are we have done the worst depleted nature in the world. We have no serious program in place about restoration of nature. We've seen during the pandemic how important it is that we are able to engage with nature. How do we tackle the question of waste? Currently, we regard so much of our society emphasizes built-in obsolescence, so that profits continue to be made about whilst we produce things that we often don't need, whilst the things that we do need are underinvested in terms of our health, our education, etc. And we keep resource extraction, and then we throw away and we throw away and we throw away. And even on that, I mean, I read today an article in the Guardian by George Monbiot, who talks about the huge business of illegal waste. People making large amounts of money out of that, and all of this actually contributing to our climate crisis. So how do we tackle that? How do we actually treat waste as a resource and minimize the amount of stuff that we're producing and throwing away, etc., etc. So it's about a full transformation of the economy. And if we talk about a full transformation of the economy, we're actually talking about the creation of many, many, many jobs, way beyond 1 million jobs, and a lot of jobs which actually are quite localized. They reconfigure the local area, the local economy. They invest in that way. Two other points that are very crucial. One, the NHS is utterly destroyed in many ways, but it's still very difficult to imagine how we would respond to a pandemic without a National Health Service. If we were simply relying on the market to deliver the things that we need to tackle the climate, it's hard to imagine how that would be. I mean, already the inequalities are great. How would that work without a National Health Service? So another element we include is about the idea, we re-pick it up from our original work, about the idea of a National Climate Service to coordinate, to directly employ, to train a workforce that tackles the climate emergency, to organise just transition, to ensure that workers are moved into other areas. And alongside that, public ownership. And I want to kind of finish on these 2 points. Public ownership. It doesn't mean to say that we can't make demands. It doesn't mean to say that we can't create change. But the key sectors of the economy, privatisation has failed. It hasn't delivered services equitably. It has made a lot of people rich. But if these key sectors of the economy stay, what it hasn't done is tackle the climate crisis in any way, shape or form. The energy system has only transitioned marginally because there was a desire by the Conservatives to undermine trade union movement by attacking the coal industry in the 1980s. And therefore there was a need that, on the back of that, a transition away from coal. But it hasn't tackled the climate crisis. It hasn't seen the investment that we need in renewable energy. And that goes across a whole range of key sectors of the economy that really absolutely we have to demand come back into public ownership. And I think public ownership needs to be a demand for the climate movement and for the trade union movement, because that becomes a central way of actually delivering the changes that we need to tackle the climate crisis. One very final thing for me. We cannot export our responsibilities in tackling the climate crisis, and we cannot create solutions which export the problem to other parts of the world. So we have to frame, I think, our solutions within a global context, within the context of international solidarity, of recognizing that our brothers and sisters around the world, working people around the world, are fighting the same battles that we are fighting. And we cannot base our solutions on further extractivism, destroying local economies, destroying local communities in other parts of the world. So our solutions have to prioritize climate justice and international solidarity. But I think in doing that, and this will be my final point, actually the solutions are there, the technology is there. It does require political change, and it does require that we build a militancy in the trade union movement, a plan of what we can see can happen, and constant activism with the urgent requirement that we deliver this, that we fight for this as quickly as possible. And thank you very much again for the invitation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Suzanne. That was really good. And I'm going to move on now and invite Ellen Rowbottom to speak next. Ellen, over to you.
Right, thanks very much, and thanks, Suzanne. So I'm just going to briefly put a bit of flesh on some of the main themes that Suzanne's just introduced with, but with reference to the chapters that I've worked on, which are the energy and the buildings chapters. And I think that as I go on, it will become very, very clear why this work needs to be done as a public service, why we do need public ownership, and why this is not going to be handed to us on a plate, why we really need mass campaigns to implement this, and this really is an urgent matter. So first of all, that the government's goal of net zero emissions by 2050 is far too weak. I think most of us know this, as well as failing to take account of the UK's historic responsibility for emissions. It's a goal that forms part of a global formula that, if it was achieved, only gives us a 50% chance of staying within that 1.5 degrees. So far too little too late if we adhere to that programme. So in contrast to this, we've gone with in the energy generating chapter, we've gone with a framework that assumes that energy generation needs to be completely decarbonised by 2038. To a degree, that's arbitrary, but it gives us an idea. A number of things follow from this. Firstly, that, and not pulling any punches here, firstly, there is no role here for gas, whether burned as methane or whether it's used to produce hydrogen. We reject the idea that carbon capture and storage can be an effective technology to remove the CO2 emissions that are produced by burning these fuels. We also reject the burning of wood pellets to generate electricity with or without the supposed capture of the emissions produced. Also, nuclear energy we regard as dangerous and polluting, as well as quite unsuitable for the flexible energy system that we need. It's merely an expensive diversion from the renewable energy that needs to be installed and scaled up very, very rapidly. Nevertheless, an energy system based entirely on wind, sun, and water, with novel storage solutions that we need, that are going to be very important, and reinforcement of the transmission and distribution grids, can provide at least 500,000 jobs. And that's really looking at it fairly narrowly in the installation, construction, the directly related jobs, but a lot more if you include all the secondary sectors to that, the supply chain and supporting industries. And of course, the additional work that's produced in areas where people then have a lot more money to spend because they've actually got decent work. the other major theme to pick up is the need for a drastic reduction in energy demand. If we simply replaced all the energy that currently comes from fossil fuels with renewably produced electricity, we'd need to generate almost 1,400 terawatt hours of electricity a year. And that is actually about 4 times the amount of electricity that we're currently generating. And as well as that, we'd have to build in a vast amount of storage capacity, mainly from batteries, to deal with the variation in supply and demand, which is huge. Now, this is simply not feasible in terms of the amount of resources required. There's copper, steel, concrete, silicon for solar cells, rare earth elements, lithium and cobalt for batteries. And not only are these resources obviously finite and limited, not only does extracting them cause a large amount of environmental devastation in many parts of the world, but they're also, in many cases, associated with serious labour abuses and serious land grabs and abuses of communities local to where those operations are happening. So we need to limit that as much as possible. One of the ways that we do that is through a much bigger emphasis on the recycling and saving and reduction of materials through technologies as much as possible. But the biggest thing that we need to do is to slash our energy demand. We propose that we can slash energy demand across the UK economy by at least 50%. And really, I suppose the rest of the booklet is after we've looked at the different forms of energy generation that we would put into the mix and the different forms of storage that we would need to include. Really, the rest of the booklet is mainly about achieving that 50% reduction or whatever. Again, the numbers are a little bit arbitrary, but that's the sort of scale that we're looking at. Now, moving on to the chapter on homes. Homes have a very particular role to play here. First of all, the energy that we use to heat our homes and to produce hot water in the home and to run our appliances on electricity are the second biggest source of emissions in the UK, second only to road transport. By thoroughly insulating our homes, we can slash this energy demand by perhaps 80% across the board. That can't all be done at once. We can implement a program that can slash it by maybe 50% within this decade, and then continue to make deeper and deeper cuts in the energy demand by a continuing program of deeper retrofit of the homes, and also, of course, by installing low carbon and renewable sources of both heat and electricity. The benefits for residents are obvious. The benefits for health and for people's income of making their homes warmer and more energy efficient is very obvious. But there's another reason why this is important, which is perhaps slightly more obscure. That homes are also the biggest source of the daily and seasonal peaks in demand, in energy demand. The evening peak when people come home from work and put the kettle on and they start cooking, the washing machine, the heating, and of course the extra heating that people use in the winter. And this means that if we don't do something about that, you actually need to build in a massive amount of headroom into the energy generating system. You need to massively reinforce the grid, the transmission grid. You need huge amounts of storage. And of course, all of those things we do need to an extent. But the biggest thing we need to do is to smooth out those peaks by slashing the additional energy demand that's needed for heating homes during those peak periods. And we can do that through insulating. We can do that quite effectively, and also by adding things like solar heat collectors, renewable energy on rooftops, of course, and domestic storage. But in order to do that effectively, it's no use doing it the way it's been done up to now, which is on a sort of, offering bits of grants and incentives here and there for individual householders. It needs to be, the home needs to be seen as an integral part of the energy system, and it needs to be part of it. Really, all of this needs to be done as part of a public service. Rooftop solar PV, for example, could and probably should be part of it should be publicly owned as part of an integrated system. Of course, we are where we are and we have to work from that, but it's very clear that that far more integration is needed than can be provided through the market. And of course, the other thing, going back to the jobs, the significance of homes and homes insulation is that we've calculated that we're going to need to build a workforce of around 2 million to achieve this properly within a relevant timescale. So the bulk of that work needs to be done within the next 10 years. And by that time, we need to have 2 million workers, upskilled, trained, thoroughly trained, understanding the heat dynamics, the energy dynamics of the home, in whatever their specialism is. They need to understand how it all fits in. And that's a massive programme of training. It's a massive planning challenge. It needs to be carried out by local authorities in collaboration with training institutions, which need to be properly funded and obviously implemented mainly by directly employed labour. So, as you can see, that these are huge demands. But if we don't do it properly, if we don't demand these things, then we're really not going to achieve the cuts that we need in good time. And I think that's my time up. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Much appreciated. Okay, so we'll move swiftly on to the next speaker then, and obviously then we'll go to the open forum. So I'd like to invite Tahir Latif to take the centre stage. Tahir, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ivor. And just to clarify your introduction at the beginning, I'm actually a former PCS rep.
Oh, right, sorry.
No longer in PCS. I feel obliged to get that in.
No.
So I think in talking about the transport chapter, and I'll briefly touch on the industry chapter as well, it's you'll probably see a pattern here in terms of Suzanne and Ellen's contributions, because there are common themes that run throughout the booklet. And that kind of consistency is what contributes to our vision of what a future society, decarbonised society, will look like. So some context about transport. It is the largest source of UK emissions at the moment, around 27%. And significantly, over the period since 1990, while the energy sector has reduced its emissions by 63% for various reasons, transport has actually increased by about 5%. Most of that, as Ellen intimated, is road. Cars account for more than 50% of the total. And if you counted international aviation, which was previously excluded from those figures, that adds about a third to the total for transport and takes it up to somewhere close to 150 megatons of CO2 per annum, I think it is. Now, just saying that leads to obvious conclusions, which I don't need to labour, I'm sure, which is that we need to do less travelling in cars and planes, more in rail and bus, and we need an integrated transport system that works for everyone, is affordable, is accessible, and will get people where they want to go, while at the same time meeting our decarbonisation ambitions. We want to do that within the basic framework that the book as a whole proposes, namely to reduce consumption, reclaim, recycle and reuse wherever we can, where we do need to build new, to transform the processes and the materials that we use. So in terms of reducing consumption, I mean, we could interpret that in terms of transport to mean we must travel less. And certainly in the case of aviation, that is what we do mean. But I'd have to say that's probably less about you or I. We need to bust the myth that is propagated by the industry that climate campaigns are trying to stop overseas travel altogether. We can dramatically reduce the amount of aviation that goes on just by targeting principally the frequent flyers. Now, other people may wish to reduce, and certainly in terms of, or in light of the pandemic, we may well see that levels don't return for a significant amount of time to where they were before. But essentially, 70% of flying in the UK is done by 15% of the population. Just as a rough bit of maths, I worked out that if that 15% flew the rest at the same amount as the rest of us, that would cut the amount of flights by between a half to 2/3. But reducing consumption also means travelling better, i.e. to provide the transport systems that allow people to go about their lives without the impacts that we currently have on the environment. And 32 million private cars in the UK account for about 70 megatons of CO2 emissions per year. That is a colossal waste encouraged by both an ethos of private ownership and by lack of commitment to an investment in public transport. And it creates a dim view of public transport in the popular imagination. We're clear that like-for-like replacement of cars with electric vehicles is not a viable solution. You run into issues around the electrification of everything, and Ellen did talk about just how much capacity we have, finite generating capacities. And yes, replacing fossil fuels with electricity from renewable sources is a matter of urgency, but it is limited, the amount of electricity we can generate at any given time. To meet all the needs across society, and therefore we need to prioritise. Also, some of the other elements, and again, Ellen said this as well, so I feel I'm kind of repeating a little bit here, but to build electric vehicles, especially the battery requirements and the need for lithium and cobalt, which are scarce and carry implications in terms of exploitation of the global south. In the annex to the booklet on cars, we estimate that 32 million electric cars use as much of those materials as the whole of European industry does at the moment. So that's just completely unfeasible, really, or infeasible. In the booklet, we reject market-based solutions, which after all include incentivizing people to buy electric vehicles and retaining that private ownership ethos. Instead, we call for a massive expansion of public transport, rail, bus, tram where it's practical, with publicly available electric vehicles for those circumstances that require it. More provision for safe, segregated cycling and walking. So meeting the needs of people through a range of different modes of transport. The booklet describes how those transformations can come about for each mode. So I won't go into all the details, but I think we've estimated that the number of additional jobs to those already in the transport sector that we would need is about 200,000. So here we can emphasise how those developments fit with our main themes. I mean, recycle and reuse what we can. Scrap metal, for example, to produce the steel for vehicles. Production and building in accordance with the transformation and processes and materials as I described in the other chapters. And I'll just mention that briefly in terms of industry in a moment. And importantly, long-term job security for workers, backed up by trade union rights and protections, redeployment, making use of skills that they have, and retraining where it's needed. And finally, public ownership of the transport system in the interests of all, affordable and accessible. Two important issues to underline. During the COP, there were anti-airport expansion protests took place at 18 UK airports and many more globally. Can't stress enough how important it is not to be fooled by aviation industry greenwash. Neither technology nor offsetting will solve the problems of aviation, only reducing the amount of flying will actually do that. And the second is that we're under no illusions about how difficult it will be to end private car ownership. I mean, that is a tough one to crack. People's everyday reliance on their car makes it probably the most contentious proposal, I would say, in the booklet. We don't underestimate the likely reaction, but it also speaks to the need to rethink how we live. And we caught a glimpse of this in the early stages of the pandemic, I think, but it's certainly not easy. We would reject the idea that less flying and driving would be a loss for our communities. building the comprehensive and integrated transport system we need would actually enhance the lives of many, provide many thousands of jobs for workers, and massively reduce the emissions of our current methods of travel. That may be ambitious, but it is what we need. Just briefly on industry, the chapter on industry talks about a range of raw materials, steel, concrete, plastic, and how these are produced and used. From this, we derive the themes mentioned earlier. Reducing consumption, how much more stuff do we actually need to produce? Reclaiming, recycling and reusing, so using scrap metal to produce new steel and recycling plastic. And where we do produce new, to transform the processes from the carbon intensive ones that we see in our current industry to new modes of production, and using different materials that are low carbon. They are out there, but tend to be suppressed by the interests of, by large industrial interests at the moment. And as I think possibly Suzanne may have mentioned, or maybe it was Ellen, that we also reject the idea of carbon capture and storage as a solution to those industrial issues. If you can produce materials without generating the carbon, surely that is better than continuing to produce carbon and just hoping some giant vacuum cleaner is going to come along and suck it all up afterwards, which is completely unproven anyway. So we reject that as a solution. I think, Ivor, I'll probably end there and we'll go to the discussion. But yeah, thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks for the time.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Tahir. Much appreciated. Steve's actually going to coordinate the questions while I do the technology behind it. So over to you, Steve.
Yeah, okay. Hilary.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just really pleased that this pamphlet, however we want to describe it, has come out. It is so timely after the failure of COP26. And I also think it's brilliant that it's being hosted by the Medway Trades Council, because the trade unions, workers and their trade unions have got such a critical role to play in getting us from where we are now to where we need to be. And I remember when the original 1 million climate jobs pamphlet came out, one of the ways that we launched it was by having a caravan around the country. So there were hundreds of us around the country launching the leaflet as part of a rolling programme. And that was very, very successful up here in the Northwest where I am currently. And I also used that pamphlet a lot during the anti-fracking protests at Preston New Road. We had trade union days at the camp there, and we referenced that pamphlet a lot, and it went down really, really well. So very, very timely and very, very welcome. And I'm really looking forward to getting my copy. I've just got a couple of points for discussion, really. I mean, I'm sure I'm going to agree with everything that's in the booklet, and but the problem is, how do we get there? How do we achieve what is in the booklet and what needs to be done? Because as Ellen said, there aren't any individual solutions to this. Most people can't afford individual solutions anyway. Even if electric cars were the way to go, people can't afford them. And so, I mean, at the moment, we've seen a lot of Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain type activities. Again, most of that seems to me to be, kind of an individual response, although it's done collectively. And I wonder whether, because of the timescale that we've got, whether there is a space for a push for mass civil disobedience. So that's a point for discussion, really. And the other point I think I'd like to make now is that as I think Suzanne touched upon it, that the just transition is much wider than just workers and jobs, although that's very, very important. And it seems to me that, you know, this phrase of levelling up that the government are very keen to use, but actually not keen to do anything about, that's part of a just transition as well. You know, at the moment, people die because they can't afford to heat their houses. People without cars are often stuck completely because we don't have a public transport system that allows people to get to where they need to be or where they would like to be. So I think an emphasis on that just transition as well is very important. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Hilary. Ed?
Steve and everyone else, thank you very much, and special thanks to Suzanne, Ellen and Talia for actually those educating us in the green and promoting the booklets for the green world, so to speak. And I say that because back in September I attended the Labour conference, and the green issue was very much there. And one of the things that affects us as trade unions is obviously the New Deal for workers, which obviously came into mind. And the other thing is when we ever listen to policies, one of the things is for me as a trade union is taking that back to my colleagues back into the workplace, and the questions and having those debates and convincing those guys as well. Is when we get that New Deal for workers, which actually featured climate, was very much part of that. Obviously, central collective bargaining, those jobs being unionised, etc., etc. But the thing is that also came to mind was the Economic Policy Forum posted by Patrick Allen, and how this is going to be costed on how we actually, because that's the first question: how much is this going to cost? For me, if I was to go into to put solar power panels on my house, it's going to cost me a lot of money that I won't be able to afford, regardless how many grants that come into play. When we start talking about electric vehicles and charges and other infrastructures and things like offloading the fossil fuel, not using the gases and everything else that you three guys have actually spoke about, that's going to take some initial costing on that. So where is that costing going to come from? There is an appetite there for our energy companies to be publicly owned, despite the leader of the Labour Party using different terminations of what he regards as public ownership. But that's certainly the cause for concern with me, is that for us to actually get this, you know, to how are we going to get the initial costs, and what's the program on how we're going to do that? And just obviously, Steve, your opening comments as well. Again, when people say to me that obviously the booklet's been researched, I've had absolutely no doubt at all that is the case. But it'd be great if you could actually tell me who's actually did the research for this booklet as well, please.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Chaz.
Okay, no, thank you to all the contributors. I do remember the original booklet coming out, and I reread that booklet last year when I knew, earlier this year when I knew the new one was coming out, and it strikes me that when that booklet was written, it was really written to try to make the case for a green transition. And I think the argument has moved on. You know, everybody agrees there needs to be a new transition now. Well, virtually everybody who is sane. But the argument is, well, what type of transition and who's going to pay for it? And I think that what's important for us to put is that when you actually look at the capitalist solutions, And all three speakers have made, all four speakers have highlighted it, is that there isn't really a solution on a capitalist basis, because capitalism is based on increased consumption of stuff that you dig out at low cost out of the ground, or you extract in some way, and that you add value to through cheap wages and some investment, and you pass it on to the consumer, and it's based on a throwaway society. So that's, no type of green transition is going to take place on a capitalist basis, which you can, when you look at the amount of time that we've got in order to achieve this, that can be quite dispiriting. You can end up in despair, feeling that that you've heard this term doomerism that's been put around, and I think that there is a tendency amongst the broad mass. I'm not talking about the youth who are out on the streets around COP26 and the ones that we're meeting at the demonstration in London and elsewhere. The youth are thinking in terms of the importance of radical change, but amongst the broad mass of workers, there is this sense of fatalism, I think, that well, there's nothing that we can do. But of course, it is relatively simple, and the wealth is there in society. What is missing is the recognition of the power of ordinary people, of organized ordinary people, which we represent here, to actually take control of society and run things in the interests of the mass, and so that it doesn't degrade the planet and kill people. So it really, for me, focuses us on what we really need to do. There is no false wall really between what we need to do now and what is important for the future of the planet. And I don't buy this idea that workers are only really interested in the bread and butter issues. I think the workers can raise their sights to the big tasks, but we have to raise the confidence and the combativity of workers to actually have the confidence to run things that are produced because they're needed and not because they can be wasted. I'll leave it there, but thank you very much. I will definitely buy a book and sell. Cheers.
Thank you.
Right, Kevin.
Yeah, good evening, and it was great to hear from all the speakers today. And I just wanted to ask the speakers on their opinion of just isolating one section that was being talked about, like, for example, aviation travel. And a lot of the time, it very much is like when people talk about aviation travel, that the onus is being put on the ordinary public and saying, look, in order to reduce emissions, then as far as aviation travel is concerned, you need to travel less. I just wanted to know what their opinions on was. Do you think we should be refocusing that attention and putting that attention on the airline industry and the aeroplane builders who make the aeroplanes, and putting the emphasis on them and saying, look, it's for you to make a more sustainable model of aeroplane for people to use, rather than putting the onus on the travellers themselves. So just want to know their opinion on that, really.
Francine.
First of all, I'd like to thank the speakers. It was very clear what they were saying. It was very useful as an adjunct to the book. It really helps. But I think sometimes we're a bit pessimistic. I think you've got great ideas, and how we get there is difficult. But I live in a very conservative and quite elderly part of Kent, and here people are really becoming aware. So I think things like XR, Insulate Britain, they are raising awareness. People are doing things like not taking their car every time they go out. It's not much. They're recycling everything they can, and they're trying not to eat so much meat. So it's small scale, but there is an awareness, and that's a start. And of course, it's much, much more highly developed in other areas. So I think we shouldn't be too negative. I do like the idea that Hilary mentioned mass civil disobedience. I'll be in that group. That sounds great. But I have got a couple of questions as well. How could just transition lead to levelling up? It was a point one of you raised, and I thought that was quite interesting. A couple of other questions. Explain to me how heat exchange pumps work, because I've heard quite a lot of people who've got them and they don't work. They actually make people use more power, which is not good. The other question I had is, would more home working, which of course the government is so shilly-shallying about, would that make a difference, or has it made a difference? And could that be something, instead of, so that workers really have the choice, because a lot of workers don't work at home. And then just silly things really, but I'd be interested, is shipping equipment and food and stuff better than flying it around the world? And where does HS2 come in all this? Because obviously that's having a huge effect, and the debate doesn't quite make sense to me. So I'm interested in that. And finally, sorry, I'm going on. How do we get people to give up their cars? I can see electric cars aren't the answer. I've met quite a few people who bought electric cars and think they must be the answer because they've been told they are, and they're not very politically minded perhaps, but they think they're doing something good. But it's this whole idea that your car is not just transport. I mean, it's not enough to say you just need to have a public transport system. Yes, absolutely. But also people see cars in terms of their identity, in terms of their status. How do we stop that marketing aspect of cars that actually means that people have a car when they don't even need one because it makes them feel good? So I've got lots of questions as well.
Yeah, again, thanks to the speakers. Everyone's got a heat exchanger in their house. It's the back of their fridge, and people are quite used to the technology. Let's go back to sailing ships, solar and wind powered. It's all free, but the key part is to kind of energize people into taking action and realizing what they can do and realize their power. And we have a huge way to go in transforming people's self-belief and their ability to organize and work together. The trade unions are obviously where you've got to work. Every time you can achieve something, other people can be inspired to do more. Look at Greta Thunberg, just one person sitting outside of school. These things can build and you can develop a massive fight back. We've got a massive hill to climb. But if people can recognize their power, people can learn from other actions, learn from XR, learn from trade union struggles. We've got to push our side of the argument, as we are tonight, but to masses of people, and get people to realize that they can transform things. And we're not necessarily going to win, but we've got to somehow energize a large percentage of the population. And I do believe that mass action and mass disobedience is a good way of giving examples that can inspire other people.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I mean, I think what is very, very important about the importance of this pamphlet is that it needs to be pushed deep into the trade union movement and everywhere else, because it's a very positive explanation about what is necessary. Now, the thing is that certainly one of the problems in the trade union movement at the moment, of course, is that there is still an awful lot of the idea of that transition is basically what the employers say and what the government says, CCS, nuclear, gas, and there was that dreadful TUC motion that was passed by my union, Unite, and quite a few others. And I think the thing is that the argument we have to make it very, very clear is that things cannot just keep going on and everything will be fine. Because the problem is, it's not climate change is going to bring enormous amount of chaos and disruption. So we've seen with the pandemic how people suddenly found themselves abruptly, their job disappeared. Overnight, their jobs disappeared, and they were unemployed. People who never expected to be unemployed, and that sort of thing is going to happen again and again and again. We're seeing already the massive events that are happening around the world, and these have an economic impact. You don't even have to have an event here in the UK. You can have it somewhere else, and it can have a massive economic impact that will actually see companies going under. Suddenly, people discovering that their jobs no longer exist. So the idea that we can just jolly along and everything will be fine, like there's no transition, because the alternative to a planned just transition is chaotic, destructive, unjust transition. And I think we have to make that argument very, very loudly and frequently and keep pushing it. And the longer it takes to get in, the more people are going to find out for themselves that is the case. And we also need to say that the point about the thing about the trade union movement, about organised workers, is that we have enormous potential power. And that is a potential power that we are going to have to use to actually bring these sorts of things about. And so these are big arguments that we have to win.
Okay, so thanks everyone for that. That's a really interesting and useful debate. There's a few questions there. So what I'd like to do now is invite the three speakers and Steve to respond to those. So I'm going to bring you all up on screen at the same time.
Okay, well, I'll just quickly run through the points that I jotted down, conscious of the time, of course. So I think, how do we get people out of cars? And I think I suppose the glib answer is that we offer the kind of public transport that people want to use and that actually meets their needs. It's a bit more than that, because it's also about planning our spaces as well, and how things work and all that kind of thing. But it is essentially about having a better transport system than the private car will give you. Someone did mention shipping. Is it better than flying stuff around the world? Well, ships may be slightly less of carbon emitters than airplanes, but they also take a lot longer to do so. So it's kind of it's in the balance, that one, I think. The question on aviation about travelling less and the onus on airlines and airports to actually do something rather than us travelling less. I think in the short term we do have to travel less. We have to reduce the amount of flying. But as I tried to emphasise in my original contribution, I think there are people other than those here at this meeting and just the mass of ordinary people who could reduce an awful lot first before we do. And that would make a huge difference. As for the onus being on the industry, well, yes, technology will eventually come along that will make flying better, but that's a couple of decades away at the moment. In terms of winning workers over, I mean, I think we have to recognise that some of the resistance is because of the precarious employment environment that's been created by 10, 12 years of austerity, and where that's put unions and their workers. What we need to do is to persuade them that long-term job security is actually in climate jobs, because the kind of polluting industries that those workers may be employed in at the moment and are going to phase out at some point. They are going to have to come to an end, and therefore, if you really want to support your workforce, you need to be planning for that eventuality right now. And finally, just on how do we achieve it? Well, I'm sure Suzanne will give a broader answer, but just something about my personal experience is that there are campaigns around, at the moment around airports. It doesn't have to be airports, but that I've been involved in at Gatwick and at Leeds Bradford, where they've looked at alternative employment plans for the local region that meets the needs of those local areas, using the workforce that might otherwise be employed in aviation. If you don't expand those airports, you can actually redeploy those workers into socially useful jobs, and that in the absence, I think, of national leadership, which we do have a big absence at the moment, those kind of locally based campaigns, if there's more of them and they can link up, then we can actually create a bottom-up grassroots movement that actually demands these kind of climate jobs. So I'll leave my contribution there, and thanks again for inviting me.
Thanks, Tahir. Over to you, Ellen.
Yeah, I'd like to start with, I'd like to say how satisfying it is that the discussion moved so quickly onto the question of how do we organise, how do we get it done. That it's clear that there's a very, there's a lot of awareness about what needs to happen, and that people are wrestling with this question of how do we build a movement that's powerful enough to actually make it happen. I'll just address a couple of more specific points first. The thing about heat pumps not working. I mean, as somebody's already said, it is basically, it's the same technology as a domestic fridge, but I think it is an illustration of this idea the government has that even though the amount of money that they've talked about putting into heat pumps is minuscule and derisory, but actually this whole idea that by chucking in a technology as an add-on that that solves everything. We do need lots and lots of heat pumps to be installed, but they need to be installed in properly insulated buildings, in buildings that are suitable for that technology, and they need to be properly installed by technicians who understand the energy dynamics of the building. It needs to be done properly, and the people who use the building need to understand how to use it as well. And they're not the only technology that is suitable. There are other technologies: solar collectors, thermal stores, thermal batteries, a variety of things that people are far less aware of. I just wanted to say about the question about getting people out of their cars as well, because yes, it's having an excellent public transport system is part of a wider thing, like the government over not just the current Tory government, but going back longer than that as well. There's been a very successful kind of ideological campaign to brainwash people into thinking, only being able to think in individualistic terms. And so, I work as a counsellor, a therapist. That's my day job, and the number of people whose issues are now concerned with status, essentially concerned with making comparisons between themselves and other people. That young people having fantasies of the pauper to the prince kind of fantasies, and it's very people. This kind of ideological program of getting everybody's internalized, or so many people have internalized this kind of individualism that feeds this idea that it's a good thing to have a bigger, more powerful car, or whatever, maybe clothing, or whatever, how it's expressed. But I think that obviously the antidote to that is demonstrating the satisfactions and the power that can be gained through collective action, through doing things collectively. And there are many, many ways of doing that. And I think that comes kind of back to, the question, what do we need to do? We need to massively scale up the power of the environment movement, and also its expression through the trade unions. And I think that there's so many things going on at the moment now that what I'm starting to think very much is that a big part of the key to this is being able to link up the initiatives that are happening at all kinds of different levels. So there are lots of community initiatives that are all about trying to get local authorities to do things. There are lots of people doing direct action, sort of XR style, or other campaigns. But the level of awareness about the central role of workers and trade unions, I think, is still low in the wider movement. And conversely, perhaps the level of awareness about environmental issues is perhaps low in the wider trade union movement. So it's really, we've done a lot to bring those two sections together, I think, through organising around COP, but that can only be a start. We need to keep building on that. And I think, because the money is there. We know that there's no, just the bit about that there are no capitalist solutions, and that can lead to despair, because how do you overthrow a system in a matter of a few years? Well, yes, it's true that we need radical system change, but it's also true that every bit counts. There is never a point where it becomes useless to stop working and stop trying to achieve things on a smaller or a larger scale. So I think it's for people to understand that is important, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ellen.
Thanks, Ivor. And I want to say, first of all, I want to thank Satinder, who very early on in the chat put a really important link to a report from Amnesty about the urgent humanitarian crisis in Madagascar, which is a direct consequence of climate change and is threatening the lives of millions of people in that part. That is the reality. That is the lived reality for people now. That's our future. It is impacting unequally. Those least responsible globally are suffering the greatest impacts. And yet again, at COP26, even that very basic sort of sense of international solidarity, where the richer countries provide the money to allow those poorer countries in the global south to develop, but to develop sustainably, to share technology, to deliver the money, even that dragging their feet, still not being delivered. And Steve mentioned it, the climate crisis is, we know what crisis looks like. I mean, these last couple of years have shown us the reality of crisis. We feel it. We can see what it looks like when you cannot get petrol to fill up your car. Obviously, you understand what I'm saying. And the food doesn't appear to be there on the shelves in the way that we've become accustomed to, and whatever. All of those kind of things will be the reality of the world unless we are able to tackle the climate crisis. So I think that's important. Thank you for the discussion is the other thing I want to say. In terms of some of the questions, I'm not going to comment on the ones that were, apart from one. I just want to add to what Tahir said in terms of aviation and Kevin's question, because it isn't. I think I want to remind people it's the most unequal form of transport. Aviation is the most unequal form of transport. It is the rich globally that travel. Tahir mentioned in his report, during the pandemic, the number of flights reduced, but not private planes, privately chartered planes. They continued. And it's very, very rich who use this form of transport more. But for us, it's a form of transport that working people use sometimes for holidays. It's actually incredibly, the stats on it, I should have them in front of me, but loads of working people don't have a holiday. Actually, that's still the reality. You can't afford a holiday, don't have time, are too sort of tied to work to be able to afford a holiday. That's the reality for loads of working people. But we have to see it in the round again. Actually, one of our demands should be about increasing holidays. A lot of the time that people perhaps use air travel rather than other forms of travel because they've only got a small amount of holidays. If we had more holidays, we're demanding and shorter working week and all that. Actually, we can use other forms of transport as well. And Eurostar, which should be what the investment goes into to allow people to travel to the continent by a more sustainable form of transport, actually didn't get the subsidies that air travel got during the pandemic. It was sold off by the Tory government. Osborne sold it off cheap to a private equity company, and its future is now in question. It shouldn't be in question. Why should it be in question whilst the airlines are being bailed out by the government? So we have to keep looking at things in that round. I want to pick up on Ed's question about education and about funding. I mean, I think Ed, in the comments that you made, you touched on the problem. If the cost of tackling the climate crisis is pushed back onto individual workers, it will get a backlash, because individual workers are already struggling to make ends meet. And if they feel the costs of the climate crisis have been unfairly pushed on them, then clearly people, will resist or worry or not understand, what can be done. Will see it as something that they have to deliver, as opposed to, we can deliver this as a public service, we can deliver this as a privatized industry. Second thing I want to say on that is, every time it's been tried in that way, it has failed. So the Green Homes Grant, a bodge of money that the government said would be handed over to private companies, but you had to put in. It tends to be the better off people that put in for that, but that didn't deliver the insulation to people's homes that were needed, because basically private companies weren't able to deliver. They took the money, pocketed it, and homes haven't been insulated. And it's the same in terms of solar panels. That there was money put into it, but it was all on a kind of individual basis. Here's a grant, take the grant, put solar panels on, and then the government pulled the plug on that as well, and said that the solar industry was getting too much support. And it doesn't deliver the joined up, I mean, sorry to use the expression, but the joined up, planned transformation that we need of our economy. So hence the argument that we make in terms of a national public, a national climate service and public sector. I do think we do need to continue to educate, though, and have these debates, because there's a lot of arguments put out there which falsely argue what we need to do. In terms of money, Ed, I think that's an important question, but I just want to say this. 3 things, I think. In the last decade, billions have been found when we were told that there wasn't money available. In 2008, billions were found to bail out the banks that had caused a massive economic crisis, and they're sitting pretty as we speak now. That was taxpayers' money, and then we had 10 years of austerity that followed that. In the pandemic, billions have been found, and unfortunately, far too much of that money has ended up in private companies who haven't delivered what they said they were going to deliver, whether that's from PPI or whatever else they were given billions of pounds of taxpayer, many of them Tory party donors and friends and all the rest of it. So economic orthodoxy is actually very fluid. Money can be found when there's political will. I'll give you the figures of what has been said. This is the Office for Budget Responsibility says that 1.4 trillion will be needed to meet the government's plans for net zero by 2050. They're the kind of figures that people are talking about. The Committee on Climate Change suggests that the 50 billion a year needed over the next 30 years to meet net zero is completely affordable. So these are the government's advisors who say that the amount of money that is needed is affordable, can be generated within, even within our current sort of setup in terms of the economy. And also all of these point out, as it was pointed out in the chat, that actually if we don't deliver on these things, the costs of the impact on the economy of not tackling the climate crisis will continue to escalate. Whether that's dealing with flooding, whether that's dealing with extreme weather, whether that's a health service that can't respond to the increased ill health that is caused, by heat, or whatever it is. So, or the infrastructure that's destroyed because of extreme weather events, etc., etc. So it can be afforded, but we also have to add on. We know here that people, the tax system is unfair. The super rich that avoid tax avoidance and have very low taxes compared to the rest. So those are the kind of also the bigger political questions that we do need to tackle. It's unjust. It's unfair. We have a rich minority who seem to just wallow in money, and they should be paying their fair share in terms of the climate crisis. My final point is about how do we do it. That's the difficult one, isn't it? I do agree with what Chaz said earlier on, though. The debate has moved on. When we first started doing this stuff over a decade ago, jobs and the environment were always pitted against each other. That argument has moved on. People recognise that actually tackling the climate crisis, you can create jobs. Even those, on the other side of the political fence, will talk about we're doing this to invest in jobs or whatever it is. So it has moved on. It doesn't mean to say there aren't debates. I think it's a difficult one. Obviously, that's the big challenge, is that how do we transform society? It's also difficult to stay positive. It was good to remind us that attitudes have changed, attitudes shifting. But yeah, when you look at the scale of the crisis that we're facing, it can, you can get very frightened and very fearful and very doomist, is, I think somebody used the word there. But I think we have to work at a number of different levels. And I would just say these. Fracking, I want to remind people, the government were committed to fracking wells up and down the country. They used absolutely every resource at their disposal to impose this on working class communities, using the jobs argument, we're creating jobs up and down the country, and they met resistance. They met resistance from local communities, direct action. People refused to let the wells, the equipment onto site. Trade unions got involved, supporting the anti-fracking campaign, and thus it went on. And there is not one fracking well as we speak in this country at this moment in time. So we can win some boots. I know it's not the scale of the climate crisis. I think we need to move on these levels. I think we do need to work within the trade union movement in terms of education, in terms of fighting in all of our unions for policies which reflect the scale of the crisis and put forward the solutions that we know can tackle the climate crisis. And that is not a one argument in every union. So we do have to move, we do have to work on that level as well. I think we have to work on campaigns. People mentioned it. Transport is an obvious one. People say, question how do you get out of your cars? It's different in different areas, but in some areas there isn't any decent public transport. That seems to me to be a very meaningful campaign in some areas that trade unions can get behind, that the community get behind. Where's the investment in our public service and our buses, etc., etc. The same in terms of insulation. We have to work on the level of campaigns. There is a different mood. So, for example, in Birmingham, when car workers at GKN were faced with the closure of their plant, they make the parts, part of the supply chain in terms of the car industry in Birmingham, they came up with a plan. And they went to, and the same kind of thing, it's more complicated in terms of Rolls-Royce, but different things are happening. They came up with a plan to go to their employers. We know that we can be making things for a low carbon industry. Why isn't the investment going to that? So there are some changing moods, and there are some demands going up in terms of the trade union movement to maintain jobs, transition jobs, etc., etc. And then I think we do need direct action, civil disobedience. We mobilized around COP, but COP's not going to go away. Every year now we have to have a focus on COP, because they are supposed to deliver, more of what we know we need to deliver. So it gives us an opportunity to bring the movement together, to mobilize in that way. And we have to keep hope, because it got hope, then I'm not quite sure what we are going to do, despite the difficulty of doing it. Can I thank everybody, but can I also ask people definitely get those orders in, invite us into your trade union branches, get the orders in for the climate jobs, building workforce for the climate immunity, get your individual copies, get your copies for your branches, for your trade union branches. And thanks very much for really what was an excellent discussion, excellent meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Suzanne, Ellen and Tahir. Steve's going to wrap up in a sec. I just wanted to read one comment from the comments. There was some really good, powerful stuff in there, which for me kind of sums it up. From Mike, I think it's Blaymeyers. I beg your pardon if I got it wrong. It says the simple answer is that if we do nothing, it will cost us the earth. The payment must come from those with the capital. For me, that sums it up. It's important that we do things individually, absolutely. But if you want real change and real impact, then we've got to organise. My union, all the unions have got to organise, local people have got to organise, and we've got to demand, because you get nothing from power without demand, and that's the truth. So over to you, Steve, to wrap up.
Right, okay, well, thanks to everybody. This has been a really good meeting, and the start, I hope, of something much bigger. I mean, I would reiterate Suzanne's closing remarks. This pamphlet it's important. And branches have got money and they can buy them for the members to read. Also, this meeting has been recorded. It's going to be put up on YouTube once Ivor's done his editing magic. And that needs to be disseminated widely. I mean, you can, again, send that around your branch membership. You can have a meeting around it. You know, all these sorts of things are tremendously important. As I said much earlier, it's about, we need to push this deep into the trade union movement and elsewhere, and into the environment movement, because it is a positive, clear explanation about what is necessary to do, and it is something that is going to make people's lives better. And not only is it going to make people's lives better, it's going to avoid their lives getting extraordinarily worse if we don't manage to achieve this sort of thing. So we've got to push. We've got a job to do, and now it's time we can get stuck in. We now have a weapon. Let's get stuck.